Hello, and on behalf of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, I'm Mark McClellan. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar on ensuring sufficient manufacturing capacity for COVID-19 therapeutics. This is a topic that has not received the attention we think it deserves as part of our efforts to confront the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been there's been a lot of focus on the role biomedical research can play, a lot of focus appropriately on containment, diagnostic testing issues and the like. But manufacturing of therapeutics is going to be increasingly important, especially as we have more effective therapies and potentially effective therapies coming to market. And we want to make sure those are available to the right patients without any unnecessary delay, given the urgency of addressing the pandemic and the limited availability of effective therapies right now. There are a lot of efforts going on worldwide to expend significant resources to develop an effective vaccine. That's the ultimate way out of the pandemic. But in the meantime, people are continuing to contract COVID-19, and there's a potential for therapeutics to help us significantly blunt or mitigate the most serious complications associated with COVID-19. Not cures, but containing, avoiding more severe admissions, avoiding the deaths that are occurring still too frequently in hospitalized patients, and especially those who get more advanced breathing difficulties. So these therapeutics in the meantime can help, and whether they're new drugs or existing drugs or new biologics, they're likely to be approved on a significantly faster timeline than vaccines. The clinical trials are shorter, and the potential for getting to market, therefore, is sooner. These therapies, as I think see on the next slide that Haley is going to be sharing, fall into a number of categories. First are antiviral drugs like remdesivir, already on the market for emergency use. These are treatments that directly affect the infectivity of the virus or its consequences, its reproduction capacity in cells. And remdesivir is the one that's farthest along in this category. A second category of immune modulators are therapies that are particularly focused on the patients with serious diseases. So those hospitalized patients that account for the deaths and the features of this pandemic that make it distinct from just a typical flu season or something like that. These fall into multiple categories. One example is dexamethasone, which made some attention with preliminary reports from the recovery trial this past week. That's an old anti-inflammatory drug. Also in this category are a number of monoclonal antibodies and other biologics that mediate immune responses in other conditions where immunomodulation has turned out to be important. And then finally, monoclonal antibodies, other biologics, and drug products that affect blood clotting, which seems to be associated with a significant number of complications and deaths as we learn more about the nature of these severe complications in COVID-19. Many of these treatments are in development right now. The third category is human antibodies, and these are products that are derived from people who have recovered from COVID-19 infections. We do know that people generally mount immune responses, and as we have more recovered individuals, there's more potential for using recombinant plasma or hyperimmune globulins derived from these survivors and the neutralizing antibodies that they produce to help with containing more severe cases and potentially earlier treatment for people at risk for COVID-19. If you look across these categories, we've seen some challenges, though, in getting sufficient capacity given the size and scope of the pandemic. For antivirals, although remdesivir manufacturing is ramping up, there are many patients who are hospitalized who would benefit based on what we know from the emergency use authorization that are not able to get treatment today because of capacity and manufacturing constraints, even as the supply is ramping up now. For the human antibodies from recovered individuals, while those treatments may ultimately turn out to be significantly helpful in some cases, the supply is going to be limited by the availability of serum from recovered patients that has sufficient antibody, neutralizing antibody titer. And that's why this fourth category, monoclonal neutralizing antibodies, is a potentially important one. This is one where there is already significant investment by NIH in supporting clinical trials of multiple agents, and those trials are underway now. The hope is that these synthetic monoclonal antibodies will provide that kind of neutralization of the virus at a considerably larger scale than would be possible through human antibodies alone. And because these monoclonal antibodies can be tailored to respond to one or more antigens on the virus, they could potentially be even more effective than the range of immune responses that we're seeing mounted in individuals who recover. And again, we'll hear more about these products in just a few minutes. So here too, though, if we don't plan ahead for manufacturing, there may be challenges in terms of timely availability of effective treatments for patients. So to build out if we go to the next slide, we've talked before about the importance of turning a linear and often uncertain process for medical product development into a hyper-parallel process in the context of the pandemic. And that includes several things happening at once. One is a clear guidance from regulatory authorities about what's needed to demonstrate safety and effectiveness, and the awareness on the part of manufacturers of what's needed. FDA has done that with some very clear guidance for therapeutics that the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research put out recently. Also planning ahead for learning more about these treatments after they're approved for emergency use or after the actual marketing approval, because there will be many unanswered questions: timing of doses, potential dosing levels, effects in subgroups of patients that would benefit from learning more about the electronic data systems that we have available. Second is planning for timely clinical trials, and networks like NIH's ACTIVE, supported by Operation Warp Speed, and other clinical trial networks are intending to accelerate the possibility of actually conducting and completing these trials quickly. For hospitalized patients, it shouldn't take more than a month or two, if you follow the FDA guidance, to determine whether treatments are safe and effective or not, if you've got enough patients enrolled in a well-designed study platform. And that's what these platforms are really all about. What we're focusing on here is manufacturing capacity, and every stage of this pandemic, a critical issue has been dealing with the scale and scope of the pandemic in a timely way. That's happened for manufacturing capacity for ventilators. It's happened for manufacturing capacity for test kits and test reagents. And as we get more effective therapies available, it will likely be an issue if we don't plan ahead for it for manufacturing of the therapeutics as well. One example of these important therapeutics, as I just mentioned, involves monoclonal antibodies. They're currently being tested in 4 groups. I think if you go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about that. What we've done in this slide is translated the potential indications for monoclonal neutralizing antibody use into population demand if the pandemic stays at current levels. Remember, the pandemic could get more challenging as we head into the fall. People go back to school and work, and to a larger extent, and we're seeing upward trends in the pandemic in many parts of the country. So this shows that there, with these 4 potential groups for testing, hospitalized patients, a relatively small group of severely ill patients, about 130,000 expected patients if we stay at current levels over the next 6 months, 2.4 million if these monoclonal antibody therapies start being used for non-hospitalized symptomatic patients, and then much larger groups of patients. Remember that these neutralizing monoclonal antibodies could have important effects on preventing close contacts from becoming infected, and also could help frontline workers, particularly healthcare workers. Now, these are very big numbers, and it's probably going to be the case that not everybody in each of these additional groups, especially close contacts or healthcare workers, would be prioritized indications for using these treatments. But I hope you get an idea of the scale of which COVID-19 therapeutics may be needed from this chart. And we can compare that to in the next slide to the number of doses that has been produced in the past for Americans using, in this case, monoclonal antibodies. So this is data from 2019 from IQVIA, with about 53 million doses of monoclonal antibodies given to US patients. So over a 6-month time period, you think about what may be most relevant before there are vaccines available and when we're looking at potential increases in caseload. So the next 6 months or so, that's about 26.5 million 26.5 million capacity in 2019. And you can see that even if a large share of the people who could potentially benefit from monoclonal antibodies don't use them, there's still a potentially substantial issue in having enough manufacturing capacity, having enough drug substance to meet the cumulative demand for neutralizing monoclonal antibodies in the months ahead, especially if we try to extend use beyond just hospitalized patients to prevent the hospitalizations, to contain the push that the increased caseload in recent weeks is having on straining healthcare systems. So we want to cover these issues today. We're going to start with a session on ensuring sufficient manufacturing capacity for COVID-19 therapeutics, which will include 2 presentations with some additional data on these topics. Bio and BCG will be sharing important work that they've been doing to assess manufacturing needs and bottlenecks and determine capacity. Then BDO will discuss its perspective on US and global capacity to produce biologics to treat COVID-19. I should say that some of the numbers that we just described are included in the issue brief we're releasing today. And we really appreciate the collaboration with BDO as well for producing these estimates. And then after that, we're going to be discussing with some experts where they might anticipate manufacturing challenges and what can be done now to address them. Then our second session will cover broader needs and policy considerations for the manufacturing of COVID-19 therapeutics. We'll talk about how industry, regulators, and government can work together to take concrete steps to ensure sufficient manufacturing capacity. There's been a lot of work devoted to this effort on the vaccine side, and manufacturing therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies is not as complex or at the same scale as vaccines for whole populations, but some similar issues and lessons may be relevant there too. Just to get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. This webcast is being recorded, will be available on the Duke Margolis website after the event. All the participants are going to be muted during the duration of the webcast, but we do want you to submit questions or comments. And the way we'd like you to do that is to tweet to #COVIDmanufacturing, #COVIDmanufacturing, or submit to our email address at margolisevents@duke.edu. That's margolisevents@duke.edu. We're going to try to capture these submissions, and we'll work with you. We'll work to try to get them addressed during the course of our discussion. So let's get started. I'm very pleased to kick this event off by introducing Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath. Michelle is the new president and CEO of Bio. She's a physician and immunologist who received her training from Duke University, where she was the first African-American to graduate from Duke's medical science training program, important accomplishment. Prior to her role at Bio, she's had a distinguished career, including at Johnson & Johnson, where she served as global head of evidence generation for medical device companies, and then as Vice President of Global External Innovation and Global Leader for Regulatory Sciences. So terrific background, Michelle, for your new post, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Mark. How are you?
Doing very well. And I'd like to start, we'll get to manufacturing, but you are only the third president of Bio. So this is a very special distinction. You've got a background in medicine and research and in public policy. Why this step now? And what do you see as the big challenges and opportunities ahead for Bio as an industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this has been such a traumatic yet clarifying spring for all of us. But I think it has been particularly elucidating for science it shows how necessary it is to have amazing and cutting edge scientific research at our disposals. It shows how critical it is for us to have collaboration that moves throughout our scientific ecosystem so that we can bring new solutions to patients. And as Bio approached me and made it clear that they really wanted Bio to stand for that scientific progress, that fighting in the name of the patient, and that making sure that we were doing everything we could to support that research and speed up that research, I said that is a great place to be. So I couldn't be more thrilled to be representing the 1,000 companies we have represented within the Bio membership. They're doing incredible work, and it is truly the hope that we have for ending this COVID crisis.
Yeah, and you did literally come into this job right with the peaking of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it sounds like you knew what you were getting into. How's it going so far? What do you see as some of the most important areas where the bio companies have responded, and some of the biggest challenges you see ahead?
Yeah, it's been so interesting, and it's a testament to the amazing team we have at Bio. I know you're going to hear from Phyllis a little bit later on, but we have incredible people. And so getting to meet a new team virtually has been quite an experience. And I know I'm not the only one to have that experience during this shutdown, but it's been amazing to kind of integrate into the team. They've been doing incredible work. They started in March, bringing together 500 scientists from around the globe just to talk about what was the most important thing for us to learn about COVID and how could we move forward to try to address it. Since then, Bio has set up the Coronavirus Hub, which is like the Craigslist for researchers who need to figure out how they partner and how they exchange resources so that they can speed up our progress, our scientific progress, which is amazing. It's also become a collaboration hub, which is so satisfying to see. We also have our COVID tracker, which is tracking all of the scientific projects globally focused on fighting COVID. To date, we have 500 projects that are represented that actually are trained at trying to stop COVID. 135 of those are focused on developing new vaccines, but we also have 250 that are really trained on trying to get therapeutics. So it's incredible to see how the men and women in the scientific enterprise have galvanized, have come together, and answered the call to really try to end this pandemic.
It is a pretty tremendous response. You said 250 therapeutics in development, so that's a lot of clinical testing ahead. And I know from working with you, and we'll hear from Phyllis shortly, that you all also put manufacturing up high on that list of important issues to address. Could you say a little bit more about why that's a focus for Bio too, and what some of the activities underway in the bio programs there are?
Yeah, well, what's been so inspiring about Duke Margolis through this entire pandemic is you guys have kept us trained on what are the upcoming steps that we need to anticipate. How can we think ahead so that we don't hit a barrier, we anticipate a barrier and surmount it. And Bio is on the same page with you to that regard. So, out of that March meeting, one of the things that was very clear was that manufacturing was a potential bottleneck, a bottleneck we wanted to resolve before it ever became an issue. And so we partnered with the Boston Consulting Group to do a survey of our members to find out what's their manufacturing capacity, where are they going, what steps are they taking, and how can we eventually pool those resources so that we'll be prepared to hit that 26 million potential patient population that you alluded to in your opening remarks. I mean, it's really astounding if you think about the scale of the response needed. And it's going to take all of us partnering together to make sure we're prepared. So thank you, Mark, for all of your clarion calls of what needs to be done. I think it's very important. And we'll be right there with you to partner.
Well, Michelle, we really appreciate your joining us this morning, and I think even more so, this is a very challenging time from the standpoint of managing the pandemic, when the biologics companies, the industry really needs to step up in unprecedented ways. It's also just a very difficult time for our country overall, living through this pandemic and everything else that's going on now. Thank you for taking on this leadership, and we look forward to continuing to work with you as we hopefully make progress on these really challenging public health and health equity issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great meeting.
Thank you. And I'd like to continue with our discussion on ensuring sufficient manufacturing capacity for COVID-19 therapeutics with a couple of short presentations. First, we're going to hear from Philip Burke from the Boston Consulting Group, who's going to talk more about the survey that BCG and BIO conducted related to these manufacturing issues. Philip, great to have you with us today, too.
Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. First, thank you very much to Michelle for inviting us to partner with them on this very important initiative. This was something that we at BCG had also identified as a critical concern. As some of you know, most of my work at BCG over the last 15 years has been with biopharma manufacturing organizations and their teams, doing a lot of work on network design, network strategy, how that plays out over time. So we were pretty familiar with the types of constraints that were likely to happen as this relatively urgent, high volume breadth of opportunities started to come through the pipeline. The conference that BIO organized back in March was a critical catalyst, and the partnership that we've been able to put together since then has been extraordinary as we've pulled together some of this information. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. Glad you're glad that's worked out, and you're, I think, officially a co-host, Philip.
All right, fabulous. Well, thank you so much. So one of the things that I thought I would start with is just what were we trying to accomplish and what is our goal? And fundamentally, we want to be part of accelerating and increasing the availability of those therapeutics, Mark, that you were referring to before, by trying to get ahead of the various capacity bottlenecks as well as the regulatory concerns. So we've approached this in a couple of different ways. One is essentially a survey of the innovator side of the house. So the various companies that are advancing candidates, the 250 or so candidates that Michelle mentioned before, on how they are experiencing the marketplace. We're going to focus on that part of the discussion today, on what those companies are experiencing. It's a range of interviews with a set of companies across various sizes and modalities. The fundamental point, though, is that this is a very high volume set of opportunities. The number of candidates coming through is very significant. The number of players who have capacity is more finite. And so one of the issues is that making sure that those two things match up, where the very specific capabilities that are needed for a particular candidate come together with the highest value opportunities that are out there. And we'll talk about that in a second. So just broadly, I know many of you are very familiar with what goes into manufacturing of therapeutics, but when we surveyed our various players here, the partners here who were involved in production, we grouped them into 9 broad buckets, recognizing that beneath each one of these 9 buckets are very specific sub-elements that need to be worked through. We then surveyed and spoke to the various innovator firms that are pushing these forward to get a sense of which ones of these were most critical. And 3 of them really stood out. The first was around biologics drug substance production. That is one that 80% of the companies that are progressing a therapeutic that requires biologics drug substance, which is about half of the therapeutics in the broader portfolio, are having challenges to line up sufficient capacity in that step. And we'll talk about some of the themes beneath that in a second. The second area is around sterile fill finish. There it's a little bit less, only about 2/3 of the companies are focused on that, but it is one that could be particularly acute because it's in some ways a shared technology with potential vaccines. And so as the vaccine candidates get further along in their production, some of that capacity could end up shifting back and forth between vaccine candidates and therapeutic candidates. And then the third area is lyophilization, which, while a smaller fraction of potential therapeutic candidates, is a very significant bottleneck, has been historically for the industry, even in normal times. and is likely to create challenges as things go forward. You'll hear in a few minutes from one set of analyses on the potential capacity that's available to serve these. We are also doing surveys, and Gil, who's also on the panel, can talk to some of the work that we're doing with the CDMO community, and Phyllis knows very well the work that we're doing with the bio community on the potential capacity that could be made available there. One of the things that we've found is that the candidates and the companies that are developing them fall into three broad groupings. The first grouping largely has internal capacity or existing strong networks of capacity that they can access in order to bring their products to market. This company in some ways needs the least industry support in the sense that they tend to have a vision for how this is going to be produced, how to scale it up, and so on. These typically tend to be companies that are already relatively large scale with extensive networks with multiple products already on the market. In group two are companies that largely don't have their own manufacturing for the end-to-end supply of the products that they're bringing to market, but do have existing partnerships that they can leverage. And for this group, it's more about ensuring that that capacity remains available at the right time in the right way, and that as the market dynamically changes, they're in a good position to work with their partners and for the partners to potentially help them move products around so that they can scale up as the candidates succeed over time. The third group is in many ways pre-existing partnerships. So they tend to be the earlier stage companies that didn't necessarily have a product on the market that are now trying to dramatically accelerate development of their candidate to meet this very acute need. In some ways, this group of companies has the biggest challenge. They don't have an existing set of supply chains that they can leverage. They are looking for partners to help them scale up. Many of those partners already have candidates from groups 1 and groups 2 that they're trying to push. And so in many ways, this group of folks needs the most support from the industry, as the innovation ultimately could come from any one of these companies. It is by no means a foregone conclusion that the successful candidates are all going to be in any one of these groups, and from large companies, small companies. And so managing across all three of them is going to be an extraordinary part of the effort. Now, because I'm presenting, I'm going to take a minute to talk about the topic for your second panel. I hope that's okay, Mark. But as we did these discussions, we also talked to companies about what some of their concerns are from a policy perspective, which I know is going to be part of the second half of the conversation here. That fell into two broad groups. One is the interactions with the industry regulators in the US, primarily the FDA, and ensuring that those partnerships remain strong as they have been to date, while taking into account the extraordinary speed that these companies are trying to work at in order to deliver these products into the marketplace. So within that, they're calling out the ability to work very closely with regulators upfront on developing the plans and the timelines for getting things through the regulatory and development process. The second is around ensuring that to the extent capacity is available or can be made available by moving certain products around within the manufacturing network, that there is support for doing that in a highly collaborative way. And finally, there is a set of questions around regulatory harmonization, and especially around questions like, if we work closely with the FDA and get something approved through the FDA process in terms of manufacturing site, can we also use that approval as a way to begin to market our products or supply our products into other regulatory jurisdictions? That is obviously a long-term challenge, but is a particular issue at the pace at which these companies are trying to operate. The second category of questions here has to do with trade policy and competition. And there, it's more about ensuring that the marketplace continues to operate, that the companies are able to source supplies and ultimately move product across the world, are in sort of the first two buckets. And then the third bucket, which is a funding problem, has to do with the amount of money that some of these companies are deploying in order to set up capacity that may ultimately not be needed. So not all of these candidates are going to succeed, but some companies are buying ahead and are committing substantial amounts of capital to potential manufacturing capacity. So thinking about ways to manage that risk over time. So as we've gone through this process, we've had a number of interactions, both with the large pharmacos, with the CDMO industry, with the various innovators. We are moving into a phase of trying to quantify this and trying to get to a very specific set of recommendations. Part of that is working with the PBOA. Part of that is our focus with BIO, with the innovator companies, on developing a way to do matchmaking across companies that have candidates and companies that have potential capacity. The results of this survey will be available over the next month or so, and we hope to be able to work with the industry along with BIO and along with the other trade organizations in order to make this a reality and serve our goal of getting these products to market as quickly as possible at the scale that's required in order to meet the challenge, Mark, that you laid out earlier.
Philip, thanks very much for that presentation. A great overview of many of the issues involved and interesting findings from your survey to date. Look forward to the further work. Now I'm going to turn to our second presenter, Patty Seymour from the Bioprocess Technology Group at BDO USA. So Patty, over to you.
So again, thanks to Mark and the Duke Margolis Center for this opportunity. So wanted to start off, BDO has been collecting information on biomanufacturing facilities since 2003 in our proprietary BioTrack database. And we publish this information 2 times per year. And so our most recent publication came out in April of this year, and it contains about 175 companies possessing nearly 275 biomanufacturing locations that cover what we're talking about here are the manufacture of mammalian or microbial expressed biopharmaceuticals. For today's purpose, we're going to be focusing on mammalian expression, particularly monoclonal antibodies. And given that the BioTrack database covers essentially all biomanufacturing facilities in the US and Europe, and most major manufacturing facilities in Asia and other emerging markets, only to the extent that those facilities are designed and capable of meeting US and EU regulatory standards and are able to provide products for US and European market. To that end, it does not include what we refer to as in-country, for-country manufacturing facilities. So all the data that I'm going to be sharing is from publicly sourced information. Everything has a reference where we can trace it back to a publicly disclosed piece of data. And when something isn't explicitly published, we do have algorithms where we can actually forecast and back calculate some of the manufacturing capacity information based on the reported square footage or the cost of the construction of the manufacturing facility. So the data I'm showing here is our forecast that going over 10 years from 2014 to 2024. And so since 2014, the supply of recombinant mammalian capacity has steadily grown about 1.4 million liters through 2020. And today in 2020, we estimate there's approximately 5 million liters of capacity. And by that, for those who may not be familiar, we refer to liters of capacity as it's the bulk drug substance that Phil mentioned, the bioreactor capacity. Think of beer manufacturing, wine manufacturing, those types of vessels are very similar to what we use to produce these types of products. So looking to 2024, capacity is projected to increase by almost 28% for another 1.4 million liters, and we expect to have about 6.4 million liters of capacity online producing product by 2014. So the question then is, how is this capacity divided up? And to provide a little bit more color on what the BCG presentation provided. So today in 2020, we are looking at three primary categories of capacity that are controlled by product companies, and those are what we refer to as the innovators, or companies that are actually marketing the products themselves. The other category are CMOs. Those are straight fee for service companies. And the third is hybrid, and those are companies that are both innovator companies as well as CMOs. For example, a company like AbbVie or Boehringer Ingelheim. And so in 2020, the product cohort makes up about 68% of all of the mammalian-based biomanufacturing capacity, or about 3.4 million liters. The CMO cohort is about 20% of the capacity, or about 1 million liters, and the hybrid cohort is only 11%, or a little over 500,000 liters. And so we look forward to 2024. This distribution, it shifts slightly in that the product companies show a slight decrease in the overall percentage of capacity to 64%, as well as a slight increase in the CMOs to about 24% capacity. However, if you look at the actual nominal values for capacity, the numbers do increase significantly. As I pointed out in the slide before, we are seeing about a 1.4 million liter installation going to happen over the next 5 years. And so when we get to that point in 2024, the product companies are forecasted based on public announcements to add about 674,000 liters of capacity. CMOs have announced about 500,000 liters of capacity, and these hybrid companies about 150,000 liters of capacity to be installed and online in the next 5 years. So now we ask, who is actually controlling this type of capacity? So we do a deeper dive and looking at the top 10 capacity holders today in 2020, and who we're forecasting to control the most capacity in the next 5 years by 2024. So 62% of the 5 million liters of capacity available today is controlled by only 10 companies. And 60% of those are product companies, again, the innovator companies, which also have their own active pipelines. Approximately 50% of this capacity also is controlled by only 7 companies to further refine that and how consolidated the control of this capacity actually is. By 2024, this decreases slightly to only 59% from 62%, with half of the top 10 companies still being product-based companies. In 2020, the group that is all others includes about 125 companies. In 2024, that increases to about 132 companies. So we're forecasting only 7 new entrants into the biomanufacturing space over the next 5 years, which frankly isn't terribly surprising because of the enormous capital investment required to build these types of facilities and operate them. However, in our database, about 25% of all these manufacturing companies have announced some form of expansion or new construction. About 31% of product companies have announced expansions or new construction, 24% of CMOs, and about 18% of the hybrid companies. So further looking at where this capacity is located. So there is obviously a global distribution to this capacity. The majority of the capacity is currently located in North America, almost exclusively the United States. There's some capacity in Canada, but it's for all intents and purposes US based, with approximately 2.1 million liters, or 43% of the global capacity is in the US. Europe has about 1.6 million, or about 31%, and Asia, as I've circled, what we're including, actually India is included in Asia as well in these numbers, about 1.3 million, or about 26%. So when we look forward to 2024, the geographic distribution shifts a little bit. Europe is significantly investing in expansion, and by 2024, we forecast that both Europe and North America will have essentially the same volumetric capacity, or about 2.4 million liters respectively, or 37% each of the capacity. And Asia will have about 1.6 million liters, or about 26% of the capacity. On a regional note, since our group is based in the Boston area, Massachusetts and New Hampshire will be installing over 40,000 liters each respectively in the next 5 years. So certainly it's good for our economy here, and certainly as a biotech hub in the region. It's good to see that they're expanding and investing in this capacity very locally. So to give some more detail on the data, we look at the types of bioreactors as well. So the range of capacity starts at very small, single liters up to, tens of thousands of liters in terms of the scale of these bioreactors. And so we categorize the scales based on the types of products that they can typically make. So products less than 1,000 liters are typically non-commercial. They're still in the investigational stage. 1,000 to 5,000, there potentially could be some low volume commercial products in that range, but typically clinical focused products. When we get greater than 5,000 liters, those are typically where we start playing in the commercial realm. However, given the need for larger volume for COVID therapeutics, we also anticipate those to be in quite high volume cohorts as well. So while we look at the overall number of bioreactors from 2020 to 2024, they've only increased a couple hundred, they're 300-ish, from 1,015 bioreactors to 1,303 bioreactors. The relative proportion of the types of investments have not changed. We're still seeing investing in both small and large scale bioreactors to meet sort of the bimodal demand of these types of scales in the industry. However, new facility construction, does appear to have similar, activity in the smaller, and those primarily are what we refer to as disposable or single-use bioreactors, and the very large or stainless steel bioreactors. And so we're seeing, again, this type of investment across the board in every type of scale and physical makeup of the bioreactor. And so the last slide I have sort of ties it all together and will hopefully be interesting for discussion as to where we're headed in available capacity. So this slide shows the total installed volume of capacity required to support the current and commercial products. So part of our product, I've shared mostly information on capacity, but we do a similar analysis on looking at all the commercial products currently on the market, as well as investigational products, and have some pretty sophisticated algorithms to forecast their manufacturing capacity demand. And so this data shows that. And by 2024, we are looking to need about 4.7 million liters of capacity. And so if you recall, the delta that we are forecasting in capacity is about 6.4 million liters by 2024. It says we have about 1.7 million liters of so-called excess capacity. This may seem like a lot of capacity, but as I showed you before, the types of entities that control it, the location where these capacities reside, can really impact who can access that capacity and for what types of products. So I think as we continue to discuss the access of capacity for COVID-19 related therapeutics for the US and for the world, we'll really have to understand how to get access to this capacity, where it's located, and what other products are competing for this demand, so that we don't necessarily stop manufacturing the other life-saving medicines that are currently relying on access to this type of manufacturing. And so that's, with that, I'd like to again thank the organizers and particularly thank my colleague Dawn Ecker, who runs our BioTrack database and is responsible for collecting and organizing this data set.
Patty, thank you and your colleagues at BDO for putting this together. A good reminder both of the challenges in increasing biologic manufacturing capacity generally and some of the issues around allocating it effectively, which I'm looking forward to discussing further as we proceed. And right now I'd like to turn to our two discussants, James Thomas and Cameron Durant. We'll first hear from James, who's Executive Vice President and Global Head of Biotherapeutics at Just Evotec Biologics, and then Cameron Durant, who's Chairman and CEO at Humanigen. So James, to you first.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's quite a daunting task as we look at the potential demands here with COVID-19. So I think myself and those in the industry like me that have been involved with this for a number of years are looking at this issue. And I think as we think about this and as we focus on this, I mean, the good news is that we've been advancing many of the technologies in the bioprocess space for a number of years. So it's not just capacity in terms of reactor liters, as Patty pointed out, but it's also in our approach to improving the yields, enhancing the yields in the bioprocessing operations themselves. So a good bit of focus has been put there, and also there have been trends in terms of modular manufacturing that have kind of come up over the last few years, and there's some significant advancements in that space. So instead of just having stainless steel fixed tank reactors, deep tank reactors, we're moving toward, as Patty mentioned, these single-use approaches and more modular approaches around developing the facilities themselves. We've been focused on this a number of years. I've been in the industry for a long time, since Genentech back in the 80s, and then a company called Immunex, and then Amgen for a number of years. And through all these stages, we've made some significant advances, but this is quite a challenge. At Just Evotec Biologics, we have put in a good bit of effort and focus, as well as other colleagues in the industry, to looking at how we can increase capacity, and not only do it from the standpoint of speed to getting things into the market, into manufacturing, but also in the cost of what we're providing these biotherapeutics. So we've taken approaches where we've integrated the technology platform, starting with molecular design, intensifying processes, but then we've put these into what we would call, I would say, clean warehouses. So we're trying to turn the concept upside down in terms of getting products into manufacturing quickly, but also getting them into manufacturing facilities that are less expensive and also can be built and validated more quickly. So our approach has really been around developing this construction so that, again, clean warehouse, we can put it in place, maybe 12 to 18 months. The manufacturing itself is done inside of autonomous clean rooms we call pods. These pods can be reconfigured to do different types of processing. They can be accessed by gowning in and out. They're made of extruded aluminum. They're highly cleanable. They can be operated at ISO 7, ISO 8. And so you can add more pods, you can scale out, not up. So we've tried to create a flexible design in manufacturing, but something that could be put in place relatively quickly. And so I think in this approach, we can manufacture tens of kilograms up to metric tons. So there's perhaps 1 to 2 metric tons. So we could get into millions of doses for monoclonal antibodies, also recombinant vaccines. So these can be configured to do different things. So So I think it is quite a challenge, but I think there are approaches out there for reacting to this and doing it in a very aggressive way with the right investments, and doing it in a way that is not, is perhaps as costly from a capital point of view as we've experienced in the past. So just some general comments, but I appreciate the opportunity to make them.
Thanks, James. Very, very much appreciate the comments as well. And now I'd like to turn to Cameron from Humanigen.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you particularly to colleagues at BIO, at BCG, and at BDO, as well as at Duke Margolis, for all of the work that's been done in preparation for this event. And I think we all hope that this is not a singular event, but it's part of a whole series of activities. So I'm CEO of a small public biotech. Part of my perspective, having a product which we think is in a potential registration phase 3 study, it's an immunomodulator that happens to be a monoclonal antibody, and so it straddles a number of the categories that Mark showed on his first slide. But the experience that I'm going to touch on is to perhaps be a little bit respectfully provocative in order to invite a conversation. And I do think that part of the power of these gatherings is in the conversations that are ignited, and sometimes there are very powerful relationships and networks that are built. So the 3 areas that I'm going to just kind of have as a broad brush, first of all, is collaboration. So we all talk about collaboration. My experience as a small public biotech is collaboration is situational, and if it benefits the bigger company, then they'll collaborate. If it doesn't, then there may be dynamics which are the opposite of the word collaboration. I won't use the word. So there's a not invented here approach. Sometimes, provided the projects are not directly competitive, there may be an invitation to participate. The way we see ourselves, and with our asset, Lenzilimab, is it's potentially synergistic with just about every other therapy, be it convalescent plasma, direct-acting antiviral, other immunomodulatory approaches, other antibodies. So we don't really see it as competitive. So it's a little puzzling to me that there isn't more outreach and true collaboration. The second is in terms of getting access to capacity. We've been fortunate that we have a couple of partners already in place with CDMOs, but they're tapped out. And some of their capacity is being eaten up, to Phil's point, by other organizations. So I guess the second theme I'd just like to invite conversation around is, so who is best placed to make a decision around prioritizing the most likely productive, positive potential assets that make it to the patient ultimately? Because that's really what we should all be thinking about. How do we advance patient care? But who's going to make those decisions as to whether this project gets some manufacturing capacity and that one doesn't? And then the third big bucket is the role of government regulators, industry bodies in both of those 2 areas of collaboration and prioritization. So should, for example, BARDA be looking at appropriating capacity on behalf of more promising projects? Or is that overstepping their mandate? So those are my big 3, Mark. Oh, got you at the wrong time.
That's right. I appreciate all of the comments, and excuse me while I clearing my throat. Definitely gave us plenty to talk about, and we're going to get into those issues further in the next panel. But while I have you all here, Patty, maybe we can go back to you. Just putting the picture together from what we've heard, the different types of companies and their need for in relationship to, excuse me, manufacturing capacity. It seems like the challenge here is that despite some of the steps that James mentioned and others, despite the fact that capacity is increasing, we're dealing with a big potential increase in demand for these types of bioreactor capabilities. And to Cameron's point, I think behind that is the feeling that there either may be a shortfall, or we may not be able to allocate it all this manufacturing capacity as well as we might. How much, Patty, do you see manufacturing capacity as potentially being a problem if we get to the point where there are a number of monoclonal antibodies and other therapies available later this year, but on the other side, a lot of potential demand?
Yeah, it is an excellent question. I do think there will be a potential problem, largely due to the pipelines for non-COVID related products were already quite robust, and capacity was already booked out for months, if not years, ahead of time. And so a lot of, certainly in the CMO space, so contractually they're obligated to fulfill those obligations, and it'll be interesting to see if they're able to renegotiate or move things around, or even if their clients themselves have reprioritized what types of products would use that capacity. With the big pharma companies, which I showed, generally control the market in terms of the, access, are they going to make some of that unused, so-called idle capacity available for some of these more innovative products? And we know some companies already publicly announced that they are doing that. So that with the partnership, I think could work well. I think I think it is very important to prioritize, but the thing is, based on what criteria, what metric are we going to do that? Is it the one that might have the best therapeutic outcome, or that also might take the longest to develop? So all these things have to be weighed carefully to see who's going to get that capacity. But in the near term, this capacity is fixed, and you can't just put up a facility overnight. Even with some of these facilities of the future, with these single-use bioreactors, it does still take months and months, if not years, to do that. And not only that's assuming all of the equipment that's needed to put up this facility is available. So I think it's not just that the actual facility; it's all the the N-1 and -2 parts of the supply chain to provide the equipment, and then the skilled workforce to run these facilities. So it's a pretty complicated network of all of these things coming together, because the industry is already unfortunately under-resourced in terms of having the right skill sets to work in some of these facilities. So getting someone trained under the right GMPs to make sure that we're not just making the therapeutics, but we're making them safe and compliant as well.
Jim, maybe if I could go to you and follow up on some of the points you were raising about the fact that there are steps that are making existing manufacturing capacity more efficient, maybe which could be built on. You mentioned some opportunities to increase some of the modular capacity. It does seem like that's not that part. The expanded capacity is probably not on the time frame that we're talking about here for potential therapeutics that could be available as soon as this fall and this year. So maybe it seems like this is going to be a little bit different than what we saw with, say, ventilator manufacturing, where Ford and GE could recruit in some additional adaptive capacity for the bioreactors. This seems like it's going to be a bigger challenge to increase supply in the short term.
Yeah, I think, Mark, you're right. These sorts of things are, we really need to get in front of them in the future, right? we need to have existing capacity that we can actually have in place and not carry for such an extreme cost, as some of the large facilities. But I think some of the intensified processing that I talked about will help with existing capacity. You can create capacity by intensifying processes, having higher yields. We used to talk about 5, and we still do from a fed batch point of view, 5 and 10 grams per liter in mammalian cell culture for like an antibody. And now we're talking about, with intensified processing, we're looking at 1 to 5 grams per reactor liter per day. So it's a different equation, and it's a different way to use potentially existing capacity. But we'll have to be extremely creative in that place as well, in that world, because that type of perfusion based type processing or intensified batch is more complex, and all the things that Patty said about having people who are trained to do this, the operations, robust processes in that space. That's a challenge. That's a challenge.
And Cameron, you raised a number of provocative topics, which we are going to discuss in more depth, I think, in the next panel. But before we wrap up here, any final thoughts or your recommendations on how to make some progress on managing within the limited supply that's available, getting that kind of collaboration and optimal allocation of the limited manufacturing capacity that we have?
Well, even if we had significantly more financial resources than we have, Mark, I'm not sure that we could necessarily unlock more capacity. So, we approach our CDMOs like the scene from the Oliver Twist book, please can I have some more? And we all want more, and we all want it earlier. Even with some of the numbers that Patty put up, we haven't yet touched on the need for long-term stockpiling and how we get there. So we're taking a run at the immediate need, perhaps for the coming winter. Obviously, with this being a global issue, the winter is all year round in different parts of the world. And so I do worry about how we get to investment for the longer term, for decades and decades worth of production.
Thanks. And Philip, to wrap up, any final comments or reflections from you based on what you've heard?
Yeah, I think that the conversation has been very instructive. I do think that the conversation in the next panel about what to do about all of this is going to be quite interesting and provocative as well. I think that the way the industry is organized under the leadership of organizations like BIO has been tremendous to a level that I haven't seen in my career to date. Recognizing that it is not yet completely smoothed out, as Cameron and Jim were both pointing out, there is the opportunity to get these therapeutics to market in a way that makes a meaningful difference even by this winter. And so I think that conversations like this are critical to getting this forward.
Right. Philip, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank all the rest of our panelists, Patty, Jim, Cameron. Really interesting findings, and thanks for setting the stage on an issue that doesn't seem to have yet had the attention it deserves, given how important these therapeutics could be in the months ahead. So now I'd like to turn to our second panel to follow up on some of the challenging issues that Cameron and his colleagues teed up in our first session. This session is going to focus on future policy considerations for COVID-19 therapeutics manufacturing. And as you just heard, the future is now with many of these therapeutics in clinical development and the potential for their availability for use either under emergency use authorizations or as approved products in just a matter of months. So we're going to talk about those short-term as well as longer-term policy implications for COVID-19 therapeutics manufacturing. Would highlight a few areas that came up in this previous discussion, and for those who've had a chance to look at it in our issue brief that we released along with the event today. First, there are opportunities to work collaboratively. So Cameron emphasized collaboration. Manufacturing capacity is going to be limited. Making sure that we are producing the most effective and promising COVID-19 therapeutics without creating shortages for other needed biologic products is a challenge. This is something where there could be further collaboration across industry, We talk about how there may be opportunities to do that. Normally, this is the kind of thing, sharing of timely and proprietary information that might create some antitrust or competitive concerns, but there's already been some guidance from FTC and DOJ to encourage the kind of collaboration that Cameron and others have talked about. And this also may be an area where the government could play a more significant role, both in terms of helping to share information and assist with the prioritization process, and perhaps in acquiring or supporting some of the manufacturing capacity. Just to remind you, we've seen a lot of activity in that direction by BARDA, working with other federal partners through Operation Warp Speed in the area of vaccine planning and manufacturing. Again, a significantly more complex, longer-term manufacturing process at an even larger order of magnitude scale, but similar issues could potentially be a path forward for manufacturing in the shorter term. And then second, as Jim and others emphasized, we can potentially take steps to use the existing manufacturing capacity we have more effectively without disrupting the availability of critical treatments that patients depend on now. Shifting production between sites, potentially pre-manufacturing drugs that we know are going to have a predictable supply need in the months ahead to free up more manufacturing capacity for COVID-19 therapeutics in the months ahead. Other steps to perhaps redirect or expand single-use manufacturing or modular capabilities as well. And along with that, financial incentives may be important. It is important to know that many manufacturers, especially some of the larger ones, have taken steps, we've already heard, to go at risk with these advanced manufacturing contracts. Those may not be of sufficient scale to meet the demand, and then again, having a process to coordinate the use of that pre-committed capacity. If some of these treatments turn out to work and others turn out not to, that gets back to our issue around coordination. So there's a lot to discuss here, and I just would to put a further point on it. We can predict what may happen if we don't deal with these issues well ahead of time, and there ends up getting to be a situation where some products may be working, other products may not. It doesn't look like manufacturing capacity is either adequate or well allocated to the ones that are most promising. And that, to Cameron's point, is when you do typically see the government stepping in with more aggressive steps, like under the Defense Production Act, and just commanding allocation. But as we've heard about, that's challenging to do in the biologics space, given the complexity of the manufacturing, the fact that these aren't all interchangeable products, different types of manufacturing capacity and issues involved, all of which benefits from planning ahead for these issues that could well be coming if we're lucky enough to have a number of potentially effective therapeutics for COVID-19 available in the months ahead. So we're going to discuss these issues further with the remainder of our time together, and I'm pleased to introduce our panel for this session. Phyllis Arthur is Vice President for Infectious Diseases at BIO. Howard Sklamberg is partner at Arnold & Porter K. Scholar, LLP. Francis Zip is at Lachman Consultants and president of the ISPE. And Gil Roth is president of the pharma and biopharma outsourcing organizations, already referenced their important role in this effort earlier. So we're going to start out with some opening comments and reactions from each of our panelists to what they've heard so far and to what they've been thinking about on these important issues. And we'll have a follow-up discussion as well. And I'm going to start with Phyllis.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for inviting us to be on this panel. This is a great discussion and really interesting topics raised from the presentations from before, particularly from Patty. That was very illuminating. So at BIO, we're obviously very concerned about making sure that the full breadth of innovative products get the opportunity to actually not just be clinically researched and be in the clinic, but also obviously be manufactured if they turn out to work. Hence why we commissioned the work with BCG. I think we saw the bottlenecks, and I think that was a very good start to a broader conversation that, and Phil mentioned, we're doing the work to actually look at capacity in a more broad sense, both capacity and capability. And the goal of that is multifocal. One, it's extremely important to understand what capabilities are out there between the broader biopharmaceutical industry and potentially the contract manufacturing organizations that work so closely in Gil's organization. Can we understand who can do which different activities across those key bottlenecks? But secondly, and maybe more importantly, can we find ways to help companies connect? Even if they're even if we get so far as to say, I'm looking for a certain capability, and here's a set of companies that actually may have that capability. So I think that one of the things we've talked about already in the opening is collaboration has been so vital to the speed of industry's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Companies out of the gate started working together to do clinical trial research, R&D research. Other companies volunteered to actually look at other companies' assets and see if they had activity against COVID-19. I think the industry has shown that it's working very closely together with a speed that I don't think we've ever seen before. Now we're at that phase where we are going to need to start helping companies connect on the more complicated parts of the development cycle. You know, clinical is one thing, but manufacturing is so uniquely specific to the product being developed. And then those fill finish issues on the end, as you said, are going to potentially conflate with all the work going on in vaccines as you fill products into the same glass vials in the same sterile manufacturing facilities. So it's really vital that we find some mechanisms to continue the great regulatory work going on between companies and the FDA, where I think things are going quite well. The FDA has been very responsive to companies of all sizes. But more importantly, how can we find some mechanisms in the short term to help companies connect with each other, either they have excess capacity and they're offering it, or they're not going to use it as they thought they were. How can we very quickly move companies into those spaces? And then I think we have to really spend some time thinking about the mid and long-term solutions for broadening the capacity within the United States. And I'm looking forward to hearing the other comments from others, but I think we are starting to think about these things as bio and think about the incentives to make sure there's investment in the right kinds of workforce, equipment, and manufacturing facility in the United States and beyond to supply these kind of products in an emergency.
Great, Phyllis. Thank you very much. And so next I'd like to turn to Howard.
Thank you, Mark. And I echo what Phyllis said. I very much enjoyed the first part of the panel and look forward to our discussion here. My point is a basic one. Which is that if one of the goals is to have regulators and manufacturers work together to address capacity challenges and avoid bottlenecks and things like that, then from the perspective of FDA, as a former FDAer, FDA has, I think we can all say, a lot of rules and procedures for everything, right? Types of meetings you can have and who you can talk to when and when you file what. Most of, or many of those rules and procedures are not in fact required. They're put in place by FDA in order for FDA to be sure that it's not favoring one company over another and that FDA is otherwise, meeting its obligations. But the agency in its statute has a lot of flexibility about how it goes about making the evaluation that a manufacturing facility, manufacturing procedures are suitable for the production of a particular, pharmaceutical, biologic, what have you. The statute itself, you look at it, is very broad and very general. And FDA in recent times, as we've seen, over the last several years, the accelerated pathways and breakthrough therapies and how much FDA has been making use of those and how much companies have been making use of those. You've seen increasing creativity by FDA in how quickly it evaluates potential new products, how quickly it, I say collaborates, but collaborates in the way that a regulator collaborates with one who regulates, discusses early in a process, and how creative it can be in addressing any problems that could arise or difficulties without delaying patient access to those therapies. And what I would hope to see in the future, and both for the COVID-19 crisis and development of therapeutics, and then maybe for some lessons learned in the future, is for FDA to kind of accelerate a lot of the things that it's been doing in the last few years, which is much earlier evaluation of potential manufacturing solutions and manufacturing challenges, which of course it's done. Earlier input of manufacturing technologies and new technologies, which it is doing now with its emerging technologies teams and task forces, and just a lot more communication. And I would say to go from a paradigm which FDA has had much more in the past of sequential review of products to one that's much more concurrent, where all the various disciplines of FDA are working together and evaluating these challenges as they come. So I think it's obviously important for this particular challenge, but I think could be lessons learned for the future.
Thanks very much, Howard. I'm going to come back to some of those issues. Next, I'd like to go to Frances.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to build a little bit on what Howard had to say and others. And, we heard a lot in the first panel, and thank you for the manufacturing capacity. And I want to really focus on the capabilities. And that was mentioned briefly, but I think it's the most important piece. Because while there will be the pods and mods for capacity, and we see many companies expanding and using these, your pharmaceutical manufacturing on wheels, as pods are referred to these days, the controls that have to be put in place at the manufacturing site within the pods are most critical. And that's where I think some of our other colleagues outside the US, they actually have some leading examples. So if you look at what came out in April by EMA and in May by WHO, they really emphasized the use of a quality risk management. Now, any of you who've actually been in manufacturing, and I come from the manufacturing and regulatory side, you actually see that on devices, you need a formal quality risk management program. You don't necessarily need that as required, as Howard mentioned, what's best practice versus what's actually statute on drugs and biologics. But these other groups are actually proposing this. And I know in the company that I run, which is a consulting company, we are getting bombarded with firms asking, what is a reasonable protocol for quality risk management? That will speed the speed to market. So once a product is approved, if you have the capacity, whether it's through mods or pods or the additional, if you have a formal quality risk management program, it really will help. And regulators are interested in that. FDA issued a document, a guidance document. I read it on Friday. I think it just came out last week. And they mentioned quality risk management, but certainly not as WHO and EMA did in their document. So I'm looking forward to further discussion on actually getting the product to the patients, which is a quality risk management approach.
Thanks very much, Frances. And next is Gil.
Well, I'm going to prattle on at length. I apologize, but I'm the one guy representing a whole bunch of the CMOs. First, just thanks for inviting me to be part of the event. It's always good when our sector gets a seat at the table. Now, Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association is a trade group, represents CMOs and CDMOs. We were founded in 2014. We have about 3 dozen member companies, along with a dozen affiliate firms who provide goods or services to the CDMOs. So our members are drug substance, drug product, clinical, commercial, large molecule, small molecule, API dosage, et cetera. We've got pure play, global multinational, single facility entities. We have those embedded firms like Patty was talking about in terms of Pfizer Center One, Baxter Biopharma Solutions, and a few other ones. So when it comes to COVID-19, our members are rising to their customers' challenge, but at the same time, they've had to reallocate production shifts to reduce employee risk of exposure to the novel coronavirus, stay on top of potential shortages in PPE, supplies, consumables, luckily not APIs, while keeping up with their existing supply agreements and doing the increases in development work and potential scale up for these COVID-related therapeutics and vaccines. So one of the things you guys likely all know is most of my members are under NDAs with a lot of their customers. Some of these companies, like Humanigen, have publicized some of the work they're doing with CDMOs, but others keep it on the QT. So when it comes to the topic at hand today, the notion of ensuring sufficient manufacturing capacity for the therapeutics, I will say what I've said in response to queries from a whole ton of federal agencies and private institutions in these past couple of months. Define your terms. I've been in contact with BARDA, ASPR, the White House, Congress, and others about available capacity in the event that a candidate breaks through and demonstrates effectiveness and we need a crash program to make it. And these queries generally revolved around vaccine candidates, but obviously the principle holds for the bigger universe of potential therapeutics. So just in the aseptic fill finish space, when I asked member companies about their capabilities and capacity on behalf of those agencies, they uniformly asked for a more specific set of parameters and terms. That is, what are you asking for? Capacity is not an easy thing to define. While a nice round number of vials per minute sounds impressive, it is not a true gauge of available capacity. Neither are liters, neither are square feet of LIO. There's a lot of other things, a lot of numerous bottlenecks that exist just within fill finish. Lab testing, warehousing, vial washing, oven, batching, filling, visual inspection, all those things are bottlenecks that aren't counted in the, this is how many vials at this size we can churn out. At the same time, some of our members have talked about that issue that came up in BCG's report about 100% of the members are worried about LIO capacity for some of these candidates. An issue here is that customers don't always know their stability, and they might opt for lyophilization when it ultimately wouldn't be as necessary as they think. The peril we have here is the crash course we're trying to engage in to get these products out. We might be engaging in suboptimal formulations and tying up LIO cycles and other parts of capacity that, had we more time to develop and work on formulation and doses, et cetera, perhaps we'd be able to get through a little more easily. Now, there's an issue when it comes to regulation and policy. We've been dealing with it when it comes to drug shortages for years. We've been talking to FDA and Congress. In a non-pandemic situation, our members are confident that capacity exists for the dosage needs of the drug industry, but capacity isn't evenly distributed. That is, a drug may go into shortage due to a manufacturing facility issue. The license holder may be reticent to work with a CDMO to restore supply because of potential regulatory bottlenecks tied to validation, stability studies, and other issues that have come up from some of our speakers just now. And while the FDA can choose to waive those requirements, it's at their discretion. And the lack of business certainty can leave a license holder unwilling to go through the process of a full negotiation with a CDMO, tech transfer, et cetera, stability studies and all that, only to get its facility remediated and back online in time to restore supply because FDA is not going to waive whatever requirement, particularly stability studies and validation, are necessary. Now, in our current situation, there is public evidence that FDA is very willing to waive requirements in order to get products to the public, whether that be through EUAs, waiving site transfers in a day to free up domestic capacity. And while that's appreciated, and while there may be aspects of regulatory overcaution, as Howard was talking about, and lessons that they can bring forward after this, sometimes there are reasons for some of these regs to be in place. And we know that FDA has to tread well, you, Mark, know better than anyone, has to tread a difficult line in facilitating swift tech transfer to ensure sufficient capacity without sacrificing quality and undermining the public's faith in safe and effective supply of treatments and vaccines. And having so many of their inspectors grounded by the pandemic right now does not help either. And when it comes to expansion and policy issues, CDMOs are caught in a catch-22 related to the fact that if one of them wants to build a new facility, they're not going to get inspected until there is a NDA, BLA, and referencing that site. And most customers are not going to contract with that site and that company without an FDA inspection. And something like that causes a artificial constraint on companies, CDMOs, being willing to start expanding capacity in some areas. There's potential regulatory relief for that, like a program in which FDA consults with the CDMOs as they're building new sites so that the facility reflects the agency's latest thinking on that area of manufacturing, and maybe tying that into a sort of pre-approval inspection. So there'd be some sort of GMP certification for the site that would enable the CDMO to bring in new customers with the guarantee that the site has actually been inspected despite not having a product in-house. So I'm prattling on at length. Like I said, our members are working with their customers to allocate capacity effectively. They're discussing projects that can be delayed without disrupting supply. They're investing in expansion to accommodate these needs. A lot of this stuff has been, well, it's been more public than talk with CDMOs usually is. At the same time, one of our previous speakers did mention equipment suppliers are another bottleneck. You can build out that facility. You are not going to get that equipment shipped over from Germany or Italy or wherever, because much like we saw with serialization and DSCSA, if everybody needs something at the same time, they can't ramp up in a quality manner the equipment that they're trying to put together. So while we're confident in our members' manufacturing capacity and quality, we're all aware that flexibility is going to play a key role in meeting this challenge. And that's flexibility from the CDMOs, their customers, their regulators, and the federal government. One addition that a member of mine did email me about just before this began, with the vaccine candidates that are potentially going to break through, there is a strong likelihood they're going to force out production of other products. And those products that are crowded out is going to lead to companies scrambling for alternatives and back orders. Potentially drug shortages could ensue. I'm not going that far, but second source planning would be wise for products that may find themselves competing with vaccine production. So thanks again. I'm here for questions.
Great, Gil, thanks for going through the whole set of issues around what exactly do we mean by supply constraints at every step in this process, and some of the potential responses. So you all have teed up some really significant issues, and I'd like to maybe divide this following discussion into two parts. First off is, how do we what are the most important steps to take now to increase capacity at pick one of these different stages or components of effective manufacturing, and this is against the backdrop of the fact that, as you all pointed out, it is challenging to bring additional capacity online, and as Gil just described, for many of the contract manufacturers, they're reluctant to make big new investments if they don't have an NDA, if we haven't created this more parallel process so that they can make that kind of investment with confidence. Howard, maybe we can start with you. You started out, you described some along the lines of, I think from some of the other panelists did, some steps that FDA might take further to clarify regulatory flexibilities, or I should say, the goal is not to cut corners, but to enable this more parallel, accelerated process to happen before we've got actual products. Could you expand a little bit more on things that FDA could do to help with some of these capacity constraints?
Sure, and I'll start off with the point you made, Mark, about not lowering standards, and it's really a two-part piece to that. One is actually, of course, not lowering standards, but also not permitting the perception that it's doing so. I think that's particularly important for vaccines, obviously, which you don't want any doubt amongst the public, given the sensitivity of vaccines. But I think I've never thought that the mechanics of the way FDA regulates and approves would be the bottleneck for therapies if the agency was creative enough. So there are a lot of obstacles. So Gil mentioned, for example, the inspectorate being largely grounded, and there have been some domestic inspections lately. But obviously, the foreign inspection program is not really started up. The agency has talked a bit about virtual inspections, But one thing that FDA could do, if you want to forecast ahead, for example, of needing to have facilities inspected for important therapeutics, and the agency not being able to waive inspection credibly because of the risk factor, but it may have to rely a bit more than it usually does, for example, on foreign regulators. So if you had a facility in Europe, the current mutual recognition agreement with Europe does not cover in a mandatory way pre-approval inspections. Pre-approval inspections are kind of optional under it. So you could imagine a more developed system where if there were a facility in a European country, the European regulator would go in and do the inspection. Maybe FDA comes along by video, and it's kind of a joint inspection which satisfies FDA's need to, quote, be there in a certain sense, and at the same time not slowing the therapy. FDA has talked a little bit about this. I think one thing that would be helpful is if the agency put out more clearly articulated guidance about what the virtual inspection program would look like. It's talked about as priorities for when it would do virtual inspections to address shortages, important therapies, things like that. But I think a lot of folks, I know clients of mine and Gil's members, friends, bios, well, you know, ask the question like, well, we want to be helpful to the agency in getting the agency information that it needs, but we don't know how to kind of go about this. And I think that's something that FDA could do. And we know it's thinking about it. And my guess is it'll do it. The other part is, as I mentioned before, from the agency perspective, sometimes one of the blessings of FDA is it's also one of its curses, which is it's a consensus-driven organization that endeavors always to be fair and treat everyone alike, which is very important for a regulator. But it also, that can slow things down if there isn't kind of a foot on the gas pedal. So I think they're going to have to basically, and they've talked about this, but again, my guess is they would have more clearly articulated guidance about how they're going to accelerate their reviews of some of these therapies. I'll make a little bit of a guess as kind of somebody watching the agency, is that Dr. Woodcock's role in the commissioner's office, and Mark, you knew her in that capacity, is she, one of the things that she's very interested in and has been her whole career is not just the evaluation of new drugs, but she's very interested in the mechanics of how FDA operates and try to get it to operate more efficiently. And also how it can interface best with agencies. And she's quite comfortable kind of taking out a piece of paper and reorganizing procedures, and also being transparent with industry. Because I think right now you have industry wanting to get out there and share the information with FDA, wanting to facilitate FDA's evaluation of what it's doing, but not knowing entirely how this will work.
Great, thanks for those comments. So Francis, maybe go to you next on the same issue of how do we increase manufacturing capacity at these key points in these key dimensions. Let's assume FDA does take some of those further steps. Do you see some path forward for bringing on additional manufacturing facilities? Can they be commissioned in a time period that's in line with the potential availability of some of these therapeutics?
Well, thank you. I think that there's going to be, as I know Gil mentioned, there are some give and takes here. So there will be products that will not be able to be manufactured. There simply is not enough capacity. So the question I have is, where are these conversations happening now? Because if you're running a CMO, you're running a manufacturing company, you know what you're not going to be able to manufacture in the future. And what are the alternatives for these other products, which eventually will make the shortage list, and some of them are life-saving. So that's the first. The second is working with the various regulators on those, as Howard mentioned, the mutual recognition. Many companies manufacturers are already seeking that. They're reaching out to their local regulators. And again, I can't emphasize enough this quality risk management. We're not going to be able to, it's a fact, there's just not enough capacity and manufacturing capability fit for use, not just physical bioreactors and numbers, but the equipment, the qualification, unless we find novel ways, mutual recognition, quality risk management. The WHO document is such a strong document. And again, I know most of you have seen that, but it talks about simple things which allow a commissioning of a facility as quickly from start to finish as quickly as 18 months. And we know many of the manufacturers are well into that, so we don't have to start from zero now. It talks about such simple things as equipment qualification and engineering runs that typically would take 36 months down to 26 months. So again, very basic items that companies are thinking about, can do, and they need to continue to speak to their regulators. Just have one last comment, and Howard touched on it, after I think Gil mentioned it. We are seeing with my firm, many companies considering how to ask for and approaching FDA for these remote inspections. And I see a very open, engaging FDA in discussions. So I do see that regulators are thinking about what we can do to not have the on-site inspection be the bottleneck.
Great, thank you. And so some further steps by FDA, which seems like they have some real potential. And also you mentioned the EMA and the WHO work around quality risk management. Seems like some potential for meaningful harmonization that would help. I do want to push, and I do want to get to that coordination issue around, some of these products may work, some may not, and how do we optimize to get the manufacturing capacity we have used most effectively. But before I do that, let me ask, maybe Phyllis could start with you. Is there any place where financial support, additional financial incentives from the government, US or globally, could help with increasing capacity available? Maybe that's help with creating incentives for manufacturers of other products to stockpile a bit now, since they have more predictability about what their demand is likely to be this year. Maybe it's around what we've seen BARDA undertake and other governments undertake on the vaccine side of procuring some additional manufacturing capacity with the idea that it could be directed a bit later to where it's most likely to be needed. Any role for similar kinds of financial supports, incentives in the non-vaccine therapeutic manufacturing space?
Yeah, Mark, I think that's one of the most important things that could be done, and it's probably a part of the midterm strategy. There's a need for incentives to increase the capacity within the US and our allies on some of these new technologies. And that can be done in several different ways. And we're thinking about this within bio. So tax incentives for the equipment issues that were actually mentioned by Howard and Gil. Tax incentives for manufacturing, for workforce training, because I think increasing the buildings and capacity is nothing without relocating in places where you're going to have a workforce that can do these advanced manufacturing and biologic processes. So these investments in essence, the bioeconomy are vital to our near-term and certainly long-term ability to respond to pandemics while also handling the unmet medical needs we face every day. So I think that it's going to be very important to think about how we encourage investment in new capacity while thinking about how much of that is for excess response to a pandemic. You can't build manufacturing for the bolus of the surge you need for a pandemic. You need to be able to build manufacturing and capacities and capabilities for the ability to at least hit that first level of response that you need to get things under control while you bring forward the varying products that you're going to need. Those things that are sitting right near the finish line might be the first things you do. But behind that, and I think we're seeing this with COVID-19, are a set of products that actually could be maybe more impactful, either complementary or even more impactful than the things that are at the front of the line. You've got to be able to invest in such a way that you can sequence products through that. And that means some level of overarching view of the capacities and the portfolio. And I think that's one of the things we're going to have to look at for COVID-19 is there are products very close to the finish line. You talked about those. Now we're learning about the great power of monoclonal antibodies, maybe immunomodulators. There's cell and gene therapies behind that. How do we leverage all those technologies kind of in sequence so that we know much, much more for this pandemic and the next one about all the capacities, and we can build the manufacturing capacity around a broad set of those different technologies and have room for surge when we need it. I think that's going to be what we're going to have to spend some real time on from a policy perspective.
Yeah, I take your point about the sequence here, about what's feasible in the short term for immediate response and pandemic therapeutics for containment, and what could be needed for the longer term. As we heard in the first panel, we're on track for some increases in manufacturing capacity, but given potential risks and wanting to avoid situations like this in the future, further steps now to make the capacity we're supporting in the short term fit well with needs for the longer term. Very important. And I'd like to come back to that if we have time. But right now, I wanted to turn to the other issue that you all have brought up, which is take the capacity that we have and whatever we can do to increase it. How are we making sure that we're using that effectively? And Phyllis, you started by emphasizing collaboration. We heard that on the first panel too. And I guess what I'm taking away from the discussion is that some of that seems to be going on among companies, and it's certainly, in the interest of a company, if they're in so that first category we heard about of having some sufficient capacity on their own, or if they're in the second category and have already contracted with some of Gill's members for capacity, but their product turns out to end up being on a slower time frame or doesn't pan out clinically very well at all, certainly in their interest to reallocate that capacity, both from a financial standpoint and to build on, as you all said, this strong response we've seen across the industry to deal with this pandemic. What else is needed to make that process go better? And again, this is one where in the vaccine side, we're seeing more active involvement from BARDA around convening and around identifying priority platforms and planning ahead for sufficient manufacturing capacity. I think I've seen less of that in this space, but would appreciate views from any of you about how to facilitate more effective coordination and planning to get the manufacturing we have to the most important uses as therapeutics do make it through the clinical development process.
I unmuted if that's okay. So I think I'm going to go back to the earlier stages. So way back, 15, 20 years ago, solid oral dosage form manufacturers started sharing information on various suppliers, equipment manufacturers, equipment suppliers, and that was in vogue for a few years and then it stopped. I think in this situation where we have to accelerate and we don't want to be totally backlogged because we can't qualify a piece of equipment or we can't get this specific piece of equipment, that industry group coming together to share that information. So every firm doesn't have to qualify every supplier of equipment, but can rely on each other and of course then do fit for use within your own firm. Many pharmacos are already talking about doing that, and they have all their lawyers involved to be sure that there's not any, the information is protected, but I think more of a collaborative discussion with regulators as well on that, so there's not a backlog.
So is there clear guidance on how to do that? It does seem like it's an area where you definitely want to consult with your lawyers because honestly, some of the information that involved in that does seem like it is normally proprietary and we're talking about actual planning across the industry about how to manufacture, which is normally not something that is encouraged by our antitrust laws. As I mentioned earlier,
technical information
available, but Gil, do you want to comment?
And trust me, one of my key goals for PBOA is that I don't go to prison. One of the, thank you. I think from where Francis is coming from, sharing technical information, I think is fine along those lines. Sharing this is how much we paid, this is the timeline to get the equipment, et cetera. No, you don't talk about that at all. And same thing when it comes to this really tricky question of reallocating CMO capacity.
Yeah.
Given that our members are under NDAs with their customers, we're not going to say, company X's product isn't working, let me go talk to company Y and see if I could slot them in. They can talk. That's verboten on our side. So it's a very fine line that, again, is meant to keep me out of prison, because collusion can accidentally happen as trade associations work, or just as companies share information. So they have to understand, not market related stuff, technical, yes. So, it's complex.
Yeah, I need to add in, because I know one of our panelists said, and there are groups out there that do share the information already. I think we all know them, and I'm not, going to put a plug in for one of those groups. However, it's when the manufacturer actually has to rely on that information during an inspection that the rub is hit, because there is an expectation that in addition to the information that's shared by a group, a consortium that goes out, can you rely on that information as yours during an inspection? And having participated in many of these, it's something that requires further discussion.
Right.
Mark, I think
yes.
you raised a really
Go ahead,
good
Phyllis.
point about the community, looking at this in Operation Warp Speed and what's happening in vaccines, where I think there is a very concerted effort to work with the core set of companies making most of the vaccines, or the early stage ones, to actually help put them in the right places and match them together according to the drug substance, the manufacturing type, the tech transfer required. There's so many more therapeutics in play. Obviously, you gave even the 4 buckets, but there is the opportunity here to potentially help look across the 4 buckets, see which products are in those buckets, which are the most in front, which are right behind those, biologically plausible, scientific, investigational products, and say, let's see if we can figure out where there might be the opportunity to put companies together. And this is something BARDA has had a history of doing in the past. I mean, they've done this well. I think we need that same concerted effort around some of the more core therapeutic areas to get some matchmaking going. So certainly bio is able to help, others are able to help. In the end, someone has to look at the whole picture and communicate which capabilities and capacities are missing, and start to put companies together for the products that are late stage, and then again for those products that may be right behind that could also have a huge impact. And you have to do both stages. You can't just do one.
Great, thanks. Howard, any comments from your standpoint, from either a legal standpoint or a regulatory standpoint on this improving coordination given the limited capacity?
Yes, comment one is I am not an antitrust lawyer at all. I know when to talk to them, but I would say that third parties, as Fran pointed out, can play a role here in terms of gathering information and, making sure the information is generalized in such a way that you don't really, you reduce the risk of those problems. And again, I don't want to name any particular third party. Fran and I are probably thinking of the same one, but I think, that's important. This is very much the lawyer in me to proceed with caution, because even when you think like, well, the regulator's okay with it, remember the antitrust laws have a private cause of action also. And, consumers can bring suit. So you just want to be careful.
Yeah. So these are good reasons for caution. And I don't want to sound alarmist here, but you all are very experienced in the industry. Let's say we proceed for the next few months, kind of on the course that we're on now, where companies are trying to acquire some manufacturing capacity, probably not enough, certainly not enough for all, depending on which product turns out to be effective. And we do get to the point come September September, October, in the fall. Pandemic is still active, and urgent need for larger scale access for hospitalized patients and maybe beyond, for monoclonal antibodies, other immune modulators, treatments that could really help. What happens then if we haven't worked through these issues? Is this a situation where we might see, like earlier this spring, more of a command approach from the government, even using or threatening the use of the DPA to just actually reallocate some of the production? Is there, it seems like these would be issues that are better dealt with early, but just want you all to help us think about what happens if we don't address some of the topics we've talked about today. Anybody want to start?
I think everything that both panels have talked about, these timelines are not something where you can just say, hey, let's start making those ventilators. You know, we can't just retool a line for this or that. So yeah, the timelines are very important, and that's part of why BARDA, you know, in what I think is a real break, started reaching out to my members directly about vaccine capacity in different doses, in different service areas. Previously, they'd only worked with license holders or applicants and essentially came to us as due diligence. More recently, I think as part of Operation Warp Speed, they want to come directly to the CMOs to try to get a better understanding of what we have and what the timelines are. But again, one of my big concerns is that the general public does not understand what these timelines are like remdesivir. That is not something you just, you know, turn on and you've got a bunch of batches. That's not even as complicated as some of these products are, and it's going to take them quite a while to get up to mass numbers.
Yeah, yeah.
Mark, I might just offer perspective to your question. What would be wrong with at least beginning the initial steps of putting some of those legislative and regulatory process in place now? So in the event that we're wrong and, you know, this just kind of fizzles out, okay. But if we don't, let's just say that we are able to develop a vaccine, or more likely a series of vaccines that will probably be necessary, that are safe, effective, affordable, offer the possibility of herd immunity. Even then, we're probably going to have to ration them. And with some of the dynamics that appear to be playing out societally, I have a further concern, which is the prospect of serious civil unrest if we are not driving toward offering patient-centric solutions very, very soon.
Yeah, I'll add in, you know, to state the obvious, we're in an election season. And the government is heavily incentivized to be able to announce something prior to the first Tuesday in November. And I'm not saying that they're going to be cutting quarters or anything like that, but I am saying that it would be a, you know, public relations disaster for there to be therapies or vaccines that actually look to be ready or safe and effective, and it turned out there was some kind of government block to, or a perception of a government block. And I don't think that would actually be a reality, because I think the government, I'm confident that it's going to do what it needs to do in order to not have the its regulatory review be a rate limiting step. But it's going to be an interesting time, because you have, you know, as I say, the government's incentivized. You have the perception of the public, and you have to make sure the public, you know, believes that these products are safe and effective. And then you're going to have, as Cameron pointed out, a necessary kind of time gap between something being announced as an important product that's out there to when it can be deployed and rolled out to millions and millions of people. And it's going to be the sociological and political exercise, as well as a logistical and regulatory one.
Any other final comments?
I've said too much.
Well, I you know, when we decided this was a good time to take on this topic together with all of you. I think we came into this expecting that we would raise more issues and questions than have answers. But I also appreciate all of the constructive suggestions that you all have brought forward, both on ways to effectively increase the capacity of manufacturing we have for advanced biologic therapeutics in the short term and for antivirals and others, and to plan ahead for using that capacity and those steps to build a better approach to manufacturing, one that is not so sequential and uncertain, one that is better able to accelerate progress and promote the kinds of interchange of capacity and steps that can get us more value out of the manufacturing capacity that we do have as well. So clearly not issues that are resolved, but I guess a second takeaway from today is that these are urgent issues to think about now. Hopefully the pandemic will not be as grim or challenging in the months ahead as it is today. I'm not sure there's any reason to count on that based on what we've seen so far. Hopefully many of these therapies that are in development will be able to make a difference. We'll keep bringing down the mortality rates in hospitalized patients. We've seen good progress already, and also make it easier for people who do contract COVID-19 to avoid hospitals or avoid contracting it at all even before we have vaccines available that work for everyone. But it does seem like some further steps are needed now to help make sure that we are in a position where we can really use those therapies effectively and widely and equitably around the country and around the world. So for those of us at Duke Margolis, we're going to continue working on these issues, I think in collaboration with the people that you've seen join us today and others. And I want to give a special thanks to our panelists for a timely discussion of a complex and underappreciated issue that could be very important for the next phase of the pandemic as we move into a phase where we actually do have increasingly effective treatments available and need to be sure that those are manufactured safely and effectively and distributed equitably and widely. Also want to thank our team at Duke Margolis who made this webinar possible. All of you who have joined us on the webinar today. We will have more projects and activities to announce in this space around pharmaceutical manufacturing. So please stay tuned, watch this space. And for those of you who are available, we'd like to invite you to join us tomorrow for another Duke Margolis webinar, Duke Margolis Alexandria Summit collaboration on reopening in the COVID-19 era. There's registration for that event available on the Duke Margolis website. Thanks again to all of you for joining us today and for all the hard work underway to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Take care.